All right, thank you. So first of all, thanks to the Queen's team, Keith and Chris and everybody else. Logistically, this has been an incredibly tight ship. It's worked great and really appreciate the invitation and all the hard work. And thanks to everybody else for spending the last session of your day when you could be racing for the doors and trying to beat the traffic home for the weekend to listen to me stand here and talk to you about polling data. As Marta said, I'm with the Pew Research Center. Just to give a quick synopsis of who we are and what we do, we're a nonprofit public interest survey research group located in Washington, D.C. Actually, we do more than survey research, but that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about today. And our role is, we see it, is to collect data on important trends that are shaping the world so that we can inform the discussions about those issues. And so the main thing that means is that we don't do policy work, so I will not be taking this as an opportunity to tell you what you should be doing with this data, but hopefully we can use this as an opportunity to give you a sense of how the public is feeling about some of the issues that have been discussed here over the last couple of days. So my organization studies a lot of things. My specific team looks at the social impact of the internet and other digital technologies. So that covers everything from attitudes towards privacy to online harassment and cyberbullying. And over the last few years, we've carved out a little niche for ourselves, looking at how technological change in the workplace, both current and coming, how the public is thinking about that. And just so you know, I'm an American. I'm going to be giving you the American side of this thing. Mike is going to be talking specifically about attitudes in Canada. But I wanted to flag that several of these questions that I'm going to be showing you, our global attitudes team actually asked them recently in a global survey that includes Canada. So in probably mid-September or so, you'll actually have Canada-specific numbers for a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about. But take that with a grain of salt that we are talking about the states, but I think a lot of this is pretty broadly applicable. Before I jump into the future of work, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what we see with the present of work. So some of my colleagues did an analysis of the U.S. Census data looking at how job categories have changed over the last 30 years or so, and it lines up with a lot of the things that people in the previous panels have been saying, which is that a lot of the vast majority of the job growth over the last 30 years has been in jobs requiring higher levels of training and preparation, and the job market has been increasingly rewarding social skills and analytic skills, and in particular jobs that require both social and analytic skills rather than physical skills. So I don't think I'm telling you anything you don't know, but obviously those trends have impacted certain workers in different ways than others. So they've helped college graduates more than people without a college degree. They've helped women more than men. But in general, the nature of work over the last 30 years or so has been changing in some pretty notable ways. And when we survey workers on their own views on this, they are very much well aware of what's going on. They are not dummies. They understand what is happening here. So when we ask them how their job compares to jobs 20 or 30 years in the past, they see a world in which there is a much greater demand for ongoing training and development than there was in the past. They also anticipate a future in which they are going to have to constantly be upgrading their skills and engaging in ongoing training. And so one data point that we really like to stress, 54% of American workers say that training and skills development throughout their career is going to be essential in order for them to be successful. Another 33% say it's going to be very important. So only a tiny portion of the population is sort of not already sold into the notion that training and development is something that's going to be extremely relevant for them moving forward. So if you think you're going to have to sell your constituents on the notion that they need to be constantly upgrading, you're not. They know what time it is. And when we ask them about the types of skills that they think are going to be relevant for success moving forward, they again say a lot of the things that, sorry, I like to gesticulate and sometimes you hit the microphone. They say a lot of the things that we've been hearing over the last couple of days. So we asked in a survey a couple of years ago, what are the traits that you think are important in order to be successful in today's workforce? And I've just highlighted the top four. There were four in particular that stood out more than any others. and that people sort of responded to in equal measure. And so the first is having a detailed sense of how to use computers and technology. I think we all get that. Right along with that is being able to interact with people from many different backgrounds, being able to write and communicate effectively, and have access to training in order to keep their skills up to date. So again, workers today, they recognize, they're saying exactly the same things that the people in this room are saying in terms of what they think is necessary in order to be successful in the job force. Marta wanted me to address this question, because I think it's an interesting one. We asked people, so okay, you've told us training and development is important. You've told us the skills that you think you need. Who do you think has responsibility for making sure that workers have that training and education in order to be successful? And at least in the States, because that's who we are. We have this very individually minded notion of who should be responsible for that. 72% of people we asked that question of say that individuals themselves are sort of, that's their job to make sure that they're doing those things. This is actually one of the questions that we asked in our global survey. So you'll have Canadian numbers for this, and it'll be interesting to see if the Canadians are maybe a little bit less individualistically minded than us Americans. And so they certainly see a role for the educational system and employers. Again, because we're Americans, the notion of government having a role in this is a little less prominent. And is much more polarized along partisan views. But in general, people really see themselves as sort of out there having to hustle for their own paycheck, upgrade their skills on their own, and see a little bit less role for other institutions to help them do that. So that's a little bit of detail that some of my colleagues have worked on, and now I'm going to get into some of the work that my team specifically has done. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about before we got into how people are thinking about how the future of work might look like is to talk a little bit about how people are perceiving the current of work from a technological standpoint. And the big takeaway here is that the current wave of technological development has really helped certain types of workers more than others. This is a really, I think, one of my favorite data points that we've collected recently. We asked a couple of questions. Has technology made your job more or less interesting? And has technology increased your opportunities for advancement or not? And if you break those out by people with a college degree, so people like the folks in this room versus folks with a high school diploma or less, you see some really striking differences. 64% of college graduates say, yes, technology has made my job more interesting. I like having it with me. It gives me agency. It gives me things that I can do and sort of takes away the grunt work and lets me focus on the cool stuff. When you ask that same question of people with a high school diploma or less, that share falls to 38%. And you see not quite as stark of a drop, but about a 20-point drop between higher education and lower education Americans on the question of whether technology has increased their opportunities for advancement or not. So the broad takeaway here is that technology as a whole has really helped certain groups of workers, has, if not actively hurt, certainly bypassed a whole segment of the population that is potentially going to be important when we start talking about automation. This is just a fairly busy chart to note that we see very similar trends when we ask not just about technology broadly, but about specific tools that people might use. I would just direct your attention to the two top bars there. If you ask higher educated workers if word processing and spreadsheet software has had a positive impact on their career, 90% of them say yes. If you ask that same question to people with a high school diploma or less, fewer than half say less. 10% say it's actually had a negative impact on them, and the remainder just say, hasn't had any impact at all. I don't deal with this. It's not something that is relevant to me in my job in any meaningful sense. I also love the one right next to that, which is a question about software that manages people's daily schedules. 2/3 of college graduates say, yes, that's had a great impact on me. It's made it so much more convenient to schedule things and do stuff. When you get to that lower income or lower education group, that share falls to less than half, and 16% say those types of tools have had a negative impact on them. So again, The broader theme here is that for people like the folks in this room, technology is something that benefits them, that gives them a sense of agency, that helps them out in their daily life. But there's a whole other segment of the population who has had, if not a negative set of experiences with these tools, has in many cases just been bypassed by that most recent wave of technological development. So with that, sort of uplifting news, I'm going to move into some questions that we asked where we asked people to think about the future, particularly in the context of workforce automation. So we've heard a lot about this over the last couple days. Daryl West's keynote last night focused on this. This is obviously a topic that is on people's minds, and so we did a survey last year where we asked Americans to think about this issue, how likely they think it is, and some of the challenges that they might see as a result of that. So I want to lead this off by noting that probably a lot of you have picked up on this. Even among people who study this issue, there's a pretty divided sense of how this might play out. We saw that in the keynote last night, where someone in the audience sort of pushed Daryl West pretty aggressively on how he could be so sure that this is going to play out the way that he thinks it's going to. We saw one of the panelists earlier make the claim that this will actually create a large number of jobs, and that it's actually going to be a great thing that all of this automation is coming along. We've done surveys ourselves of people in the technology sector. This was a few years ago, but at that point they were equally split. We basically found a 50-50 split between people who think this will be a job creator versus a job destroyer. All that is to say, I don't pretend to know how this is actually going to play out, but I think it's useful to get a sense from the public of how they are viewing this issue in an effort to help folks like those in this room figure out what they might respond to. So just to give you a little bit of detail on what we did, this was a fairly large nationally representative survey of US adults, and our goal was to examine how automation is currently impacting American workers. We wanted to get a sense of how aware they are of this issue. We wanted to get their expectations and attitudes towards how they see this potentially playing out. We wanted to get a sense of their hopes and fears, both on a positive side and on the negative side. We wanted to examine their receptiveness towards some of the common policies and regulations that have been talked about in the context of minimizing the impact of automation. And we also wanted to get a sense of whether or not they think their own job is at risk from these trends. And I just want to say this is not predictive. This is sort of a point-in-time view of how people are viewing this at a pretty nascent stage of development. But again, I think it's a useful stake in the ground to see how people are thinking about this at a relatively early stage, and to kind of bring the views of the ordinary voter into the picture. So I have one more thing about the current before I jump into the future. One of the things that we wanted to do is to just get a sense of how many people think they've been impacted by this right now as of 2017. So we asked a question, have you either lost a job or had your pay and hours reduced because your employer replaced some or all of your job duties with a computer program or a machine of some kind? And we got some pretty striking findings. So overall, 2% of Americans say that they have lost a job. 5% say that they have had their pay or hours reduced. Those are fairly small numbers, but if you look at certain subgroups, you see a little bit different story. And in particular, I want to point you to sort of the youngest adults. If you look at people who are currently in their late teens and early 20s, 6% of them say that they've lost a job. Around 1 in 10 say that they've had their pay or hours reduced. I suspect, we didn't do any follow-ups on this because we weren't sure what we were going to get. I suspect what you're seeing here is sort of early stage automation of kind of traditional teenage summer jobs. So grocery store clerks, basic data entry, kind of basic retail work, things like that. But that group in particular is one that really responded in a pretty prominent way to this question, as did folks who have relatively low household incomes and those who work part-time. So a lot of overlap between those three groups, but I think gives a sense of how this issue is impacting workers even today, before we even get into all the crazy AI stuff and driverless vehicles that haven't quite made it into full production yet. And I will note there's obviously some fuzziness around this question in terms of whether people really do know whether their employer has replaced them with a machine. And I think that point is well taken. I will note that this definitely captures the share of Americans who think they have been impacted by automation. And as we will see towards the end of my talk, I want you to keep this group in your mind. They have some really interesting attitudes towards how the future might look and what types of interventions around workforce automation might be appropriate. So, hopefully everybody's with me. With that said, I want to spend the rest of my talk talking about our questions about a future of work in which automation plays a much more prominent role than it does today. And so just to give you a little sort of full transparency, how we conducted this, we basically gave people a framing mechanism where we presented them with a fairly basic statement that just said, robots and computers are currently involved in the job market today. They're currently doing routine tasks. In the future, they might be able to do much more stuff. And then from that point on, ask them to respond to some questions about that notion. So the first thing that we wanted to know is just, how much are people thinking about this, and do they think it sounds realistic? And I think what we found was that a surprising number of them have, in fact, been thinking about this. Just 14% of the folks that we surveyed said that this was the first time that they had ever heard of this notion. About a quarter of the population told us that they had heard a lot about this. And when we asked them whether they think it seems realistic, 1 in 5 say, yeah, it seems, I fully think that this is going to happen. A lot of people kind of fell into the middle, and then only a fairly small segment of the public thinks that this is just completely out of the realm of possibility. So in general, this is not something that is just confined to academic conferences and elite circles. The public as a whole is paying some level of attention to this, and in general, they think that this is a fairly realistic thing that might happen in the future. There we go. The next thing we wanted to know is, does this thing excite you? Does this thing worry you? And what we found was that people are much more likely to express worry about this idea of computers and machines being able to do lots of human jobs than they are to express enthusiasm. There's a pretty tiny little segment of the population, about 6%, that says, I am super into this. I am jazzed about this idea. There is a much larger share, 25%, who says, I am very worried about this. And sort of a similar share that says, I am not at all enthusiastic here. One of the interesting things that we've seen across a lot of these studies that we've done, this is part of a broader survey that included some other questions about automation in different contexts. The more people have heard about this issue, they are more enthusiastic, but not less worried. And I don't know what that means. So the more they hear about it, they internalize the potential good things that could happen, but that level of angst and anxiety does not leave them in any meaningful sense. It is held up across every version of this that we have done. We've done surveys about human enhancements. We've done stuff about genetically modified organisms. This is a really consistent trend that shows up across lots of different things. It's picking up on something just inherently human that even as we kind of think more positively about stuff, the more we learn about it, that nagging anxiety and stress just never quite leaves us. At any rate, the broad takeaway here is that when you ask people how they feel about this, relatively few say that they're excited. A much larger number tell you that they are a little bit freaked out. And I think this next slide here sort of helps explain why that is the case. So we asked people about some of the likely outcomes that they see from a world in which robots and computers can do lots of jobs. And we actually skewed this towards positive outcomes, but we sort of tried to frame them around some of the issues that you hear from folks in the economic space and in academia, that possible outcomes that could result from this. And I've circled 2 in particular that really registered with people. So the first that really registered with people is the idea that inequality between rich people and poor people will become much worse than it is today. So sort of the number one outcome that people fixate on when they're presented with this idea is that this is going to be even more of a winner-take-all society than we currently have today. The second thing is sort of the reverse of that, and it's one that they don't at all fixate on or don't at all agree with. We've heard in a few different contexts here today, the notion that as new technologies come along, the economy will create, newer, better, more interesting jobs that we can't possibly imagine today, right? We've all heard some version of that. Whether that is the case or not, the public does not does not agree with that idea. 75% of the folks that we surveyed say they do not expect the economy to create many new, better-paying jobs for humans as a result of this. Just 25% say that they expect that to happen. So, in terms of what the public themselves expects to see, they expect much more inequality, and they do not anticipate this being a bonanza of cool new things to do for the humans of the world. I will note here, this is just a side note, we asked some questions about driverless vehicles in this survey as well. I'm happy to talk about those findings afterwards. I didn't want to spend a lot of time on them. I only want to note here that this notion of job loss as a result of automation is something that comes through in other types of automation scenarios that we looked at. So we did a similar set of questions in our in our survey about autonomous vehicles. The number one outcome people expect from autonomous vehicles is that many people who drive for a living will lose their jobs. So this notion of automation-driven job loss is something that comes through in a variety of different contexts around automation in general. So with that as context, we wanted to get a sense of what policies and regulations, if any, people would support in the event that this becomes reality. And so we gave them four. I want to highlight a couple of them. First, people like all of them in general. We got majority support for all four of the things we looked at. People love the idea of limiting machines to doing dangerous and dirty jobs. Got overwhelming support for that. I think that's interesting, given what we've seen, particularly in the United States. One man's dangerous and dirty job is another man's long-standing source of self-worth and income. And so I think that's sort of an interesting contrast between people's immediate fixation on that particular issue and what we've seen in the broader context. But we also saw quite strong support for things like a government-guaranteed basic income that would help people meet their basic needs, as well as a national service program that would pay humans to perform tasks even if those tasks could be done faster or more cheaply by robots. That's all interesting. What I think is even more interesting is the way these broke out by party ID. As you probably know, Democrats and Republicans don't agree on a heck of a lot in the United States these days. They actually are equally amenable to the idea that it's a good idea if we just sort of like stick the machines off doing the stuff that we don't want to do. When you ask them questions about things like a guaranteed basic income or to a lesser extent a national service program, you tend to see things fall down or fall into a more traditional partisan pattern. Great. We can talk a little bit more about why that might be the case in the Q&A, but certainly an interesting finding. We see some other interesting partisan splits on a couple of other questions that we asked. So we wanted to sort of make people give trade-offs. Instead of just saying, I support this or I support that, we tried to get them to jump into one camp or the other. And so the first thing we wanted to know is, who has an obligation to take care of these folks if lots of humans are displaced? Is it the government's obligation or is it the obligation of individuals? People split exactly 50-50 on that question overall. What's really interesting is, I'll highlight two things here. One is we didn't see a lot of difference by educational attainment, and we saw huge differences by party affiliation. So Republicans strongly in the camp of, sorry guy, you're on your own, suck it up and deal with it. Democrats much more willing to, much more supportive of government intervention. When we framed that question a slightly different way, we got a very different pattern here. So the next question we asked was, choose between there should be limits on the number of jobs that businesses can replace with machines, even if that maybe hurts their profit margins, versus businesses are justified replacing humans if it's in their economic interest to do so. Compared to the previous question, we saw much more support for the notion that there should be limits on the number of jobs businesses can replace with machines. We saw some really interesting educational splits that we didn't see in the previous question. So now all of a sudden, college graduates, for whatever reason, are like, yeah, businesses are justified. It's just the business. Yeah, it's the business cycle. What are you going to do? High school grads or less are much more supportive of the notion that there should be limits on the number of jobs businesses can replace. And even more interestingly, we saw very similar results between Democrats and Republicans. So framing this out of a government obligation to do something and into a businesses should be limited in what they can do frame seems to really change the partisan valence of these questions. And so the last thing I'm going to talk about here, I kind of saved the best for last. We wanted to get a sense of what jobs people think are most at risk. And so we gave them 8 different jobs. We included your own job or profession in that list. And we wanted to see what jobs they think are at risk and what jobs they think are safe. And so in certain ways, this lines up exactly as the experts would expect it to and what we've been hearing thus far. People think that the fast food workers and sort of basic kind of low routine knowledge work jobs are gone. They think teachers and nurses, those sort of complex, human-centered type jobs are relatively safe. The second safest job in this list was my own job or profession. Just 30% of Americans think it is even somewhat likely that their own job that they currently do could be done by a robot or computer in the future. And we looked at this. Actually, I'm going to skip through this because I know I'm running short on time. We looked at this. We sliced and diced this in all sorts of ways, looking for a group where a majority said, yeah, I think a machine can do my job in the future. We looked at it by the type of work they do, and some types of jobs or some industries have a higher likelihood of saying that than others, but couldn't find anybody, couldn't find a majority in any of the sort of broad job categories we looked at. We looked at it by educational level. College graduates think they're safer, but even among people with a high school diploma or less, only 36% think a machine could do their job. Doesn't differ a ton by age. We dug and dug and dug. There was one group that said, for whom a majority said, I think robots or computers, it's likely that my job will be done by robots or computers in the future. I'm gonna give a pop quiz here to see how much you were paying attention. Does anyone have a guess of who that was? It was people who told us, I have lost a job or had my pay or hours reduced currently as a result of automation. When we looked at that group, almost 6 in 10 said it's at least somewhat likely that their own job or profession will be done by machines in the future. And they actually expect, a lot of them expect the teachers of the world and nurses of the world to go away as well. They were pretty much, no matter how we cut this, that little segment of the population was the only one we could find that in a really meaningful way thinks that this is going to impact them and people like teachers or nurses in the future. I'm going to end on this, which is just to say that not only do they have greater expectations that they are going to be replaced by machines, they have really interesting attitudinal differences compared to the rest of the population as well. So they're paying closer attention to this. They're twice as likely as the rest of the population to say they've heard a lot about this notion. They are much more likely to say that they view this as extremely realistic. Interestingly enough, they're about 3 times as likely to express enthusiasm for it. Not entirely sure why that is, because they were equally worried. But for whatever reason, they express a little bit greater enthusiasm, and they're much more in favor of things like a universal basic income relative to the rest of the population. So I'm going to leave you with the notion that, as we're thinking about public attitudes, particularly towards automation, this is an issue that really doesn't become real for people until they actually experience it in their own lives. And at that point, they get it, and their whole outlook on things shifts a little bit. So as we're thinking about how public opinion might shift or ways in which you might be able to communicate that with the folks that you're interested in communicating it with, that is the idea that I want to leave you with as I wrap up. And I think am I on time? Nice.